First job I ever had was working at Nutbush Park, when I was 14 years old in 1974, 74, 75. And I probably walked every part of the North Carolina side of Kerr Lake, looking for arrowheads, walking the dog. It means a lot to our area. It was a game changer in the history of Old Granville County. When I refer to Old Granville County, I'm referring, of course, to current Franklin, Warren, Vance, and current Granville County. To me, one of the interesting things about Kerr Lake is this, you know, it's something everybody that lives here is familiar with, and we see it all the time. And, you know, we get kind of a view of it, and maybe we don't realize how significant it is. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today, the history of Kerr Lake. This is a view of the dam. And interestingly enough, this thing right in here, in front of the dam is Bugs Island. The Bug family owned about 6,000 acres along the Roanoke River, and they owned the area where the dam, it was purchased by the Corps of Engineers. The dam was built there. Bugs Island is not actually in Kerr Lake; it's in Lake Gaston. Now, a lot of you may be familiar. What do they call the lake in Virginia? They call it Bugs Island. In North Carolina, you call it Kerr Lake. 3/4 of the lake is located inside the state of Virginia. I will say that it is actually a state law in Virginia that it's called Bugs Island. It is a state law. I'm not kidding you. In the state of Virginia, if there's a road map or map concerning Kerr Lake, what I call Kerr Lake, they call it Bugs Island. And that was the original name for it. I'll talk a little bit about how that came about and all, why the dam was placed where it is. This is an aerial view of the dam itself. Kerr Lake Dam is actually the 4th largest or 4th longest dam in the eastern United States.
Really?
Yeah, it's a little over 4 miles long. This area that you see right here is dirt, earthen dam. The road on this side. The same thing on this side over here. All of that is earthen dam. The dam is, like I said, about 4 miles long. Only about half a mile of it, which is that center part right there, is the concrete masonry part of the dam. Okay. There had been talk. This is a nice shot too. This is an aerial shot along the Roanoke River that was taken in 1940. And the reason why I showed you this, I wanted you to take a look at the farmland surrounding the Roanoke River. And by the way, the name Roanoke is an Algonquin word. It is the name for shell. Native Americans in this area use shells as a medium of exchange, and the word for that was called Roanoke. That's where the name comes from. Incidentally, do you know what the Algonquin word is for mask?
I don't know Algonquin.
Raccoon. That's where the name raccoon comes from. Anyway, most of the tribes in the northern part of North Carolina into Virginia were Algonquin, later on Occaneechi tribes. The ones located in the southern part of the state were more associated with the Tuscarora tribe. We'll talk a little bit about this. This was beautiful farmland along the Roanoke River. Many families became very wealthy. Family names you might be familiar with: the Skipwith family, the Taylor family, the Bullock family, the Terry family, the Buggs. These were wealthy plantation owners. They made a lot of money and made quite a bit of profit off of the lands along the Roanoke River. Now, there had been talk and discussion about, even as early as the 1820s, there had been some discussion about possibly putting a dam on the Roanoke River. Mainly at the beginning because of navigational purposes. You could actually ride a flatboat all the way up to the Roanoke River, what they call a flatboat, a bateau. You could get it as far as Grassy Creek. You know where Grassy Creek community is? You could go all the way up there. That was the head of navigation in prior to the really basically prior to the Civil War for the Roanoke River. Now, even there have been, I've read letters and editorials in the paper in the 1870s and 1880s talking about the idea of building a dam on Kerr Lake. Now, let me say this, nations are awful consistent sometimes in the way they develop and the phases they go through. In the United States, from about 1910 to about the mid-1950s was the great dam building period in the United States. Hoover Dam, Glen Canyon Dam, Dam in the Mississippi River, so on and so forth. So a lot of the Grand Coulee Dam, a lot of these are you're familiar with. And interestingly enough, the Roanoke River falls into that time period. Other nations like the Soviet Union built a lot of dams from the 1930s up until the 1970s. India is still in the process of their large dam building era. Egypt built Aswan Dam in the 50s. The Chinese, you may be familiar with, they just put up in the last 20 years the world's largest dam, Three Gorges Dam. The great dam building era for the United States, I think, is over, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on. But Kerr Lake was part of that. The Roanoke River is one of the most dammed rivers on earth. There are 6 major dams along the Roanoke River, length of the Roanoke River. The Niagara Dam near Roanoke was built in 1906. Smith Mountain Lake was built in 1963 on the Roanoke River. Leesville Lake right in front of that in 1966. Kerr Lake was finished in 1953. Lake Gaston in 1963. And Roanoke Rapids Lake in 1955. Primarily, the reason why these dams were built was because of flood control. There have been something like 17 major floods on the Roanoke rivers in recorded history. One wise person said once that we get a 500-year flood on the Roanoke River about every 30 years. The worst 2 was in 1878. On Skipwith plantation on the Roanoke River, on a large tall pine tree, there was a mark on there of 38 feet. That's how high the flooding of the Roanoke River was in 1878. There's one even further above that at 42 feet from 1940. There had been talk, as I mentioned, many years, and there had even been, the Corps of Engineers had even done some perspectives and some measurements and drawings and aerial photography and a thing like that, the possibility of putting a dam on the Roanoke River. But really, what really got things going was in August of 1940, it was the Great Roanoke Flood. And this was a hurricane. It wasn't a particularly bad hurricane, but it came through the mountains of North Carolina and Virginia and dumped incredible amounts of water. The damage wound up being about $5 million, which you extrapolate that into, it was about $10 million, and you extrapolate that into money today, it was about $100 million in damage. There were 8 deaths. But here's the really bad thing about that flood. Something like 23,000 cows, horses, sheep, goats, pigs died in that flood. It wiped people out. And it was a really bad mess because people, when the river flooded, you would have like the width of the Roanoke River would be like 6 miles. Because most of it's flooding this flat plain. Okay. And this is also an era of Roosevelt and the New Deal where there was a lot of money for projects to stimulate the economy during the Great Depression, and then later on supplemented by World War II. Basically what happened in 1944, the Flood Control Act of 1944 was passed, and money was allocated for the creation of a lake on the Roanoke River. Now, before I get into talking about that, I want to talk about the Kerr. Okay. The first John Kerr was elected to the United States Congress in 1812. And he had a son named John Kerr who served in Congress. And he had a son, had a nephew named John H. Kerr, John Hosea Kerr, who served in Congress for 30 years. And then he had a son, John H. Kerr Jr., who served in the State House of North Carolina for about 30 years. And then his son served until 2008. So John Kerr had John Kerr and had a nephew named John Kerr. He had a son named John Kerr. And a son named John Kerr. All right. Why, the cars were basically from the Danville area in Caswell County. John Hosea Carr moved to Warrington in the early 20th century and became mayor of Warrington. Now, Warrington is an unusual place. If you've ever been there, it's very much, it's almost like a museum. There's probably more antebellum homes there than there are new homes there. It took until 1980 for them to actually get back to their population, what their population was in 1960. Warrington is unusual in that at one point they owned their own railroad, they owned their own hotel, they owned their own telephone system, and they owned their own electrical system. The town owned it. And the mayor was John Hosea Carr. And he was a great believer in government projects and government running things and providing a basic safety net for people. Okay?
So that's a nephew right there?
That is the nephew of that John Carr right there. This is John H. Carr that the dam is named. Okay? And he's important in that he actually ran for Congress. All right. Now listen to this, that congressional district, second district, the Warrington and Vance County, Granville County were in back in the early 20th century. In 1902, a man named Claude Kitchen was elected congressman from that district. And he served for the next 20 years. And then John Hosea Carr comes along, he said, look, he said, it's time for a change, give a young man a chance. And he won election. And then he got reelected 15 times and served for the next 30 years. Until 1952, when a man named Lawrence H. Fountain, L.H. Fountain, some of you might remember him, he ran on a campaign, said it's time for a change, give a young man a chance. And he defeated John H. Carr, and then he served from 1952 to 1982 for 30 more years. So in that district, in something like an 80-year time period, there were only 3 Congress. Now, John Hosea Carr was a very influential man in Congress. He knew how to make deals. One of the reasons that Kerr Lake is here and why it is here is because of what I call home cooking. Okay. John H. Carr was a very influential congressman from North Carolina, probably the most influential and important one from North Carolina. He's the man who established the tobacco price support system in the 1930s, which basically existed until the early 2000s. The system where you got an allotment to grow tobacco. Okay, that was his creation. There was another powerful senator from Virginia who had served in the Senate for about 36 years, and his name was Absalom Willis Robertson. And you probably don't know who he is, but I bet you know who his son was. His son said, his father wanted him to be a congressman. He said, serve in the Senate, have a political career. He said, no, I want to be a preacher. That man's name was Pat Robertson. Oh. Which you may be familiar with, who incidentally wound up getting involved in politics later. Absalom Willis Robertson was also very famous for passing the National Wildlife Act in the 1930s, which stipulates that there's an 11% tax on the sale of guns and ammunition. That tax goes to the creation of wildlife areas and support of national parks and state parks and things like that. He was an avid hunter. He wanted it, and he was an influential, and he wanted Kerr Lake to be built too. And it also didn't hurt. It was the general that was in charge of the Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineers being part of the United States Army. The Corps basically builds and operates the Kerr Lake, and many others in the United States. He was well known for being an engineer. He actually had built what was called the Lido Road during the Second World War. Have you ever heard of the Burma Road, which was a road through the jungles of Burma that was about 600 miles long, that was created? It was considered an engineer marvel in its day, and it connected India with China. And that's how the Chinese were supplied with military supplies during the Second World War. The man's name was Lewis Pitt. Matter of fact, they call that road Pitt's Pike. That was the name for it. Pitt was from here. He was from a little place called Brookneal, which is up on the Roanoke River, just north of South Austin, Virginia, up that way, in Charlotte County. And this Kerr Lake was kind of his final hurrah. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the lake itself. That's how we arrived at this point. Incidentally, that place right there is called Hibernia. And y'all may be familiar, there's a park called Hibernia. During antebellum days before the American Civil War, the Hibernia plantation was the largest plantation in all of Roanoke County. The Hargrove family had their plantation. If you live anywhere in this area, you know some people with the last name Hargrove. They're almost as common as the last name of Austin or Bullock. Okay? They were very wealthy landowners. This plantation, this is the lake in the 1950s as it was rising and filling up. Eventually, that house was torn down. It was purchased by the Corps of Engineers from the Hargrove family, and it's now a state park. And we're working on, actually, I've been working here recently with the Hibernia Park Rangers about possibly coming up with a walking trail with some of the historic sites for the plantation. That's something I hope that will come to fruition. Okay. Some things about Kerr Lake itself. Kerr Lake is actually the second largest man-made lake east of the Mississippi. Not in terms of actual acreage and size, but in terms of water volume. Okay, the actual acreage of the entire lake up to the 320 line. Now, when I say 320 line, I'm not talking about how deep the lake is. It's not 320 feet deep. This is how far above sea level it is. Okay. The water will go over the spillway of the dam at 320 feet. The Corps of Engineers owns all that green space and land around the lake. The lake itself usually has at a regular capacity about 48,500 acres, okay? But what makes Kerr Lake so unusual is Kerr Lake is deep. At the main channel, where the lake is, it averages about 90 to 100 feet deep, okay? Now, let me give you for instance, the largest naturally occurring lake in North Carolina is Lake Mattamuskeet in Hyde County. Lake Mattamuskeet, in terms of size, is almost exactly the same acreage as Kerr Lake. But Kerr Lake has 40 times more water, and much as much water in it as Lake Mattamuskeet does. Lake Mattamuskeet is only averages about 3 feet in depth. I could even walk from one end to the other of Lake Mattamuskeet. My head wouldn't get wet.
They can't ride no boat. 3 feet.
I know, it's really amazing, but that's a point of comparison to let you know how large Kerr Lake is. And when Kerr Lake floods, and it has actually gotten up to 319.87 before, it spreads out and it actually can go upwards of having 100,000, close to 100,000 acres. Okay. By the way, that's Occoneechee Island right there. That is now underwater. This is the bridge over, there's a new bridge there now, it was built in the 1950s outside of Clarksville. I had mentioned the Occoneechee tribe. This is one of the most significant archaeological sites for Native American research in the eastern United States. When the lake was being built and this area was going to be inundated by water, no less an institution than the Smithsonian Institute itself came and did the archaeological dig. It was the most significant Native American center city, really, in southern Virginia and in North Carolina. I will say myself, as I mentioned, I grew up on Kerr Lake. I have over 2,500 arrowheads and spear points and pieces of pottery that I found around Kerr Lake.
How many?
Over 2,500. Now, I'll freely admit, I did not know this when I was a kid, a number of years ago. That's illegal. That is federal property right there, okay? And I mean, there is no archaeological integrity to the site because it's all been inundated by water. And even before that, for decades, if not centuries, it had been foam, okay? But like speaking, I found this on Kerr Lake. This is a steatite bone I found many decades ago. It's steatite soapstone, and I found it in 17 different pieces. I found it, one really cold winter morning, and, it was at the edge of the water and part where it had frozen. And what happened was that it frozen and the water expanded and cracked it into individual pieces, but I was able to find it. I have not returned this to the federal government.
Don't tell me my question. Do you still have it in your possession or did you donate it to a museum?
I actually, I've got it, my plan is to donate it to East Carolina University. They've come and documented a lot of my artifacts and things like that. Here's the thing, the federal government has so much to worry about these days. And I feel like being a public-minded citizen that I am, I'll relieve them of the burden of having to worry about them. But don't tell them. No.
Maybe up there, you said.
Oh, okay. Oh, by the way, how many dams are on Kerr Lake?
Oh, wow.
That's what most people would think. Two. There's two. There's of course, the dam that everybody knows, and there's also a dam, earth dam on Island Creek. If you've ever been up Highway 39 and go on into Virginia, you'll go across the gravel, the earthen dam there. Why is it there? Because it prevents the flooding of that particular valley. And there used to be a mine there called Tungsten. Okay, y'all remember, y'all familiar with tungsten? Tungsten is the hardest known, not metal, but mineral. It has the highest melting point of any naturally occurring mineral. In 1942, the Hamby brothers from here in Granville County, Joe and Robert Hamby, were looking for gold. Granville County has quite a tradition of mining and quarrying and things like that. There actually used to be a couple of gold mines in Granville County up around the Virgin Line. Virgin Line came into existence as a gold mine. Okay. They were looking for gold. It was right at the beginning of World War II, and they found tungsten. And why is tungsten? That timing could not have been better. During the beginning of the Second World War, the entire world's tungsten supply was controlled either by the Germans, Spanish, or the Japanese. They had occupied China. Okay, why is tungsten important? I told you it was the hardest known mineral. What you do with tungsten is you put it at the end of bullets in artillery shells. Okay, it is so hard that it can penetrate that hard steel metal for like tanks, for instance. This is a German tank that was hit 18 times by British tank shells that were not tipped in tungsten. Today they use even something stronger. They use a form of uranium. But that tank kept on going. The Allies desperately needed to have tungsten to use as used during the Second World War. Show you how fast government can move when it wants to. The Hamby brothers discovered tungsten in what's now northern Vance County. In January of 1942, 6 weeks later, that mine was working. They got them a government contract. Okay. By the way, and I'm going to do a program here probably in the summertime on tungsten mine because it's close by and it has relevance. I know some of you certainly have we've talked about certainly have familiarity and have family ties related to tungsten mine. The filaments I mentioned it had the highest melting point of any mineral or metal, and that's why it was used for many years and still is to some degree as filaments in light bulbs. We used to say there's a little bit of Vance County all over the world. Oh, when you turn on the light, there's a little bit of Vance County. This is the earthen dam that keeps Island Creek from flooding. And you may be interested to know too that if you ever had any property along Hicksboro, if that dam had not been built, this whole area over here in eastern Vance County and western Granville County, Stovall would be just a couple miles away from waterfront property. It would have flooded all the way down to Hicksboro and all the way down to Williams. That was the original plan, of course, because of the value of tungsten, particularly for national defense purposes. That dam was built. There's also was interesting too. Why was the dam built where it was? basically for three reasons. Okay, if you look at the profile of the Roanoke River as it comes through this part of Virginia and North Carolina, here's the river, and the land forms a valley. It's very imperceptible. You could see it maybe if you were up in a plane, and it goes like this to a V shape. In that valley, you can build the dam in that section. Once you get past where the dam is and you get further east, you notice the land is flat. That's why you have so many like large tobacco fields and cotton fields and things like that, and like Northampton, Halifax County, North Carolina. So there was that aspect of it. But right in front of Bugs Island, the Roanoke River goes straight over solid granite bedrock. Okay? If you're going to build something there, you do not, it amazed me when I started doing research on this. Kerr Lake Dam is not built on steel supports. You know, you see somebody build a skyscraper and how they go all the way down into the ground and so on and so forth and all that. The dam is a gravity dam and it's built just poured concrete straight on that original bedrock. And it also didn't hurt that there was a major railroad route right by there, a major north-south railroad route. It also tied into a railroad line in Norfolk and Newport News in that area, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too. But there was also a nice granite quarry that was located right at the same spot. And as incidentally, the work on the dam itself was done in 1947. In March of 47, and the job was finished about 5 years later in October of 1953. That's October the 3rd, 1953 was when the dam was officially opened. At any given time during that time period, that 5-year time period, there were about 2,100 workers working on the dam. Only 4 lost their lives during the construction of the dam, but they operated 24/7, 7 days a week. Okay. And I thought it was going to be some kind of complicated process in building a dam. I'll show you a little bit. It was actually much simpler than I thought. But there was a town that was built there for the workers. And interestingly enough, the town was called Castle Heights. And the reason why was you could see the symbol right there on the water tower. It was called Castle Heights because what's the symbol for the Corps of Engineers? It's Castle. And there's interesting, the town had schools, it had a community building, the streets were named for local places, like there was Mecklenburg Street and Brunswick Street and Warren Street, things like that. And this is where the workers lived. Only about 2 buildings of the town still exist anymore. But there was an actual village there that was there for the duration of the building of the dam. How they went about building the dam, they built what they call a coffer dam. With see these things right here? These are cellular coffers. They're round cylindrical things, pieces of steel. They drop them in the water and they fill them up with sand, pump the water out. They fill them up, excuse me, not the water out, and then fill them up with sand. You can see a good shot of it. There you go, right there. And what they did, they built this about halfway out into the river, started pouring the forms and building the dam, and they got that half of it built. They went on the other side. So you can see the coffer dam right there. Okay, how do you build a dam? That's one of the cellular coffers right there. If you pour the dam itself is a half-mile long. If you poured cement and created a concrete dam, which it is, in 1/2 mile section, it would take about 125 years for the concrete to dry or cure. Okay, now let me just explain this. There's cement, there's concrete, right? Okay, think of it like this. Cement is the flour and concrete is the bread. Cement as itself is mixed with other items to make concrete. Concrete does not necessarily dry, but it cures. I didn't know this until I started doing research on this. Concrete can dry or cure underwater. The thing about concrete, or particularly cement, you have to keep it moving. Because if you don't keep it moving, it starts to set and cure and harden. But as I mentioned, it takes years for concrete to dry. If you dug up some of that concrete right there, say that thing was laid, I don't know, 2 months ago, and you went in there and took a jackhammer, and center part still wouldn't be here. People don't realize that. So what they did, they had to build 53 separate monoliths. And all they did was they just built these squares with wooden forms on them. And incidentally, they were about 144 feet tall, which is about, let's see, let me think, that's probably about 3.5 stories high. And they just poured the concrete in it and let it dry, let it cure, let it sit, and then filled in spaces in between. You could see some of the forms right there. It's interesting. There's some more construction on the dam. Incidentally, this is where the powerhouse is gonna go. I'll talk a little bit about that. Here's some more images right here. The dam itself, is consisted of about 624,000 cubic yards of concrete. They used about 578,000 barrels of cement and about 1.5 million tons of crushed stone and sand. It cost, the dam itself cost, the dam and the property that included the lake cost about $100 million. If you extrapolate that into money today, that's about $1.4 billion. Okay. Which is still only about 1/3 of the cost of an aircraft. But it's interesting to me, if you go and look at the dam today, you can actually see the wooden forms right here in concrete. For the wooden forms that were used to create the dam. Okay. The dam itself has 7 turbines. Now, where's the world's largest naval base? North River. Where's the world's largest amphibious base? Little Creek. Little Creek. Where does the city of Norfolk get their backup for electrical supply? Where does the world's largest naval base get its backup electrical supply? Kerr Lake. Where do they get their main water supply? Kerr Lake. Okay, if you are, yeah, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. I'll get to that in a minute. If you were somebody who was not a friend of the America Club, Deaf to America, you couldn't do much better than, you could really wreak havoc by doing something.
They're with the ocean. They
Yeah.
come in here getting
Well, see, what
clean water.
Well, that's just it. I'll go ahead and talk about it now. And talk about what they call it, North America's longest drinking straw. It's a 90-mile pipeline that goes from Lake Gaston to Virginia Beach, basically.
Okay.
All right, what happened in the 80s was Virginia Beach was, that whole area was growing so fast. But remember, they're right on they're in a swamp. And so what happens is that the salt water leaches into the regular freshwater supply, and plus it doesn't flush out. So contaminants and poisons and mercury and things like that start to build up. Virginia Beach actually had to put a moratorium on any new construction in 1985. You couldn't build a house or anything there. They needed an alternative water supply. Okay, the closest thing was Lake Gaston. Now, most of Lake Gaston is in North Carolina, but there's a small portion of it, the northern part of it, it's in Brunswick County, Virginia. They said, well, okay, Virginia Beach says they're going to build a pipeline from there, put a pump station on Lake Gaston, and get their water supply from Lake Gaston. A couple of problems there. Lake Gaston is a private lake. It was not built by, the specifications for it are not the same as Kerr Lake. Kerr Lake, if you notice, is fluctuates. Kerr Lake has fluctuated as much as 38 feet from its all-time low point to its all-time high point. Plus, you have a natural green area around it. Lake Gaston is not like that. Lake Gaston has never fluctuated more than 3 feet. So in order to keep, and Kerr Lake people don't like that, but there's a lot of money and some nice houses on Lake Gaston. Sure thing.
Mark, I'll just add a little bit of perspective. So I'm on the board of the Kerr Lake Regional Water Plant, which is expanding from.
And which I'm gonna talk about that too.
I'm gonna say, I gotta run the second.
Okay, go ahead.
But that plant is going from 10 million gallons of processed water per day to 20 million gallons of processed water. But to give you perspective, what that means for Kerr Lake. At normal flow, okay, like today, the lake's fine, the amount of water coming in, it's less than 1/10 of an inch difference to the water. It's non-noticeable. At its lowest point, it's at its historic low. If we were to pump 20 million gallons of water a day, it would be less than 1 inch of variation. Like, that's just to go to your point, how much volume is in that?
See, that's what I'm saying. There's such an incredible amount of water in Kerr Lake. And see, people did not, in the early eighties, the litigation on this went on for like 17 years. It finally ended in 15 years, 82 to 1997. It went up to the Supreme Court twice. There was something like 20 different lawsuits that were affiliated with it. Basically, the gist of it was this: Virginia's, though, to keep the water, the pumping station and keep Lake Gaston level, you had to take water out of Kerr Lake. Virginia says it's our water. It comes from majority of the watershed. The majority, 3/4 of the lake is in Virginia. North Carolina said, no, this is our water. So it was basically an issue between the two states. It was eventually resolved. And it did not turn out to affect, as you pointed out, Brian, it did not affect the lake levels to the degree that everybody thought it would. It's interesting to me. I'll show you a picture in a little bit. The pumping station on Lake Gaston looks just like a house. Since we're on it, I'll just jump ahead real quick and show you what I'm talking about. Right? You can see all this other stuff, but I did want to show you this because that's the pumping station right there. And by the way, Brian, I'll talk about this while you're here too. The regional water system, the northern part of Granville County, Vance County, Warren County get their water from Kerr Lake. This is basically, y'all remember something called Soul City? All right, this was a plan by a local developer named Floyd McKissick, who actually had a law practice here in Granville County. And he envisioned that by the year 2000, there would be a town of some 70,000 people living in what is now Soul City. It didn't quite make it to that. I think it was about 350 people there. But Floyd McKissick was a civil rights activist. Here's a picture of him. Marshall, that's Floyd, Ms. McKissick on the left, Martin Luther King on the right. And the strange thing was, he was a Republican. You have to remember, there's a tradition in the African American community that goes back to Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican. And in Reconstruction days, African Americans by and large measure were Republicans. And that was still around in the 60s. And Floyd McKissick was the organizer of the trying to get votes in the African American community for Richard Nixon. In 1968, there was a three-way race for president: Humphrey, Nixon, and Wallace. Nixon won a very close election. He got something like 13% of the African American vote, which is an astonishingly high. Okay, and he helped get Richard Nixon elected. So what did Floyd McKissick do? He said, "I'm going to build Soul City, and I want infrastructure. I want a water system." They had even talked to Milwaukee. What's the one out of Milwaukee to be here? Milwaukee Beer to actually relocate a plant to Soul City, and they would need millions of tons of water for that. So Floyd McKissick called in his favor with Nixon, and through Nixon's efforts, with a lot of federal money, the water system from Kerr Lake was put into effect.
In the lobby.
And by the way, they are refurbishing it as we speak.
As we speak, we're in the process of going through a generational, once in a generation kind of rehab. But in the lobby of the plant is a bronze plaque. Is with Soul City is one of the founding members of that water plant. Probably one of the last remaining signs for Soul City.
This is a terrible joke, but you know, I grew up in Vance County. You know what we always heard? This was the joke. Behind every water gate, there's a mill house. Richard Nixon's middle name was Millhouse. Okay, behind every water gate, there's a mill house, especially when they turned on the water gate at Richmond. Anyway, I jumped ahead here, but since you, Brian, I figured you would be able to add a little to that. Gosh, I've gone on. I need to wrap things up, I guess. There are 7 turbines for the power plant. About 48% of the power that's produced, 48% of it goes to what used to be CP&L. It's now Duke Power. Okay, the other 52% go to what used to be called Virginia Power and Electric Company or Dominion Energy, and it is the backup supply There are 7 turbines there. I can give you some ridiculous figure that I have no idea what it means. That it produces something like, 1.7, it produces 426 gigawatts of power per year. All I know is that's just a lot of electricity. But I mean, the electricity that we use basically comes from the dam. Now, remember, the dam was originally built for flood control. Okay, but what's happened is it produces power. And there was another factor that happened in Clay County, which was recreation. And it also created real estate. Now, when the federal government came in, oh, and by the way, a penstock runs from, this is a flow of water from the dam and turns the turbine, and it turns this turbine, and the turbine creates the electricity. And these turbines are huge, by the way. This was one that was replaced in 2009, and you can get an idea. The only place in the United States you can build these is in Newport News and shipyards. But that just shows you, and they have to be replaced every 60 years or so. There's some more pictures of the lake. This is John H. Kerr. This is General Pig. What happened was in 1952, John H. Kerr, through all of his efforts to create the tobacco price support system and create Kerr Lake, he was voted out of office by a young man. All right. So kind of as a homage to him or a tribute to him, they named the dam the John H. Kerr Dam. Now, here's where we run into trouble. There's the B. Everett Jordan Dam. Well, what do you call the lake? Lake Jordan, okay? Well, if the dam is named for Kerr, we'll just call it Kerr Lake. Well, Virginia didn't see it that way because the lake is called Bugs Island Lake, but the dam is called John H. Kerr Dam. So that's why we've got the mess we've got now. That's been going on for about 70 years. But anyway, that was the opening of the dam. Want to mention this, when you go to the dam, there's a little tugboat up there called the Dan. It was built in 1932 on Lake Superior and was a tugboat on Lake Superior. And when the Kerr Lake was made, they actually transferred it overland and was used by the Corps until 1992. It was used for recovery and rescue, and also to remove debris from the lake and so on and so forth. But it's now been replaced, but it actually is sitting in front of the dam today. And it was odd. They thought in 1964 they were going to have to get rid of it because it had a very unique kind of engine to it. It was only briefly used in the 1930s. And there was nowhere else to get one, but then they found a rum runner coming out of Cuba in 1962, and they managed to get the engine out of it and put it in, get a little bit of life to the dam. The highest Kerr Lake has ever been, I want to just briefly talk about this, was in 1987. I remember this. It was the first time they ever actually had to open the floodgates of the dam. The highest level of the lake's ever been is 319.61 feet above sea level. The lowest was in 1956 at 280.23 feet above sea level. So as I mentioned before, that's about a 39-foot variation. There is a train in the bottom of Kerr Lake. You may have heard this story. In 1919, there used to be a train track that went from Manson, North Carolina to Townsville. There was a forest fire over Nutbush Creek. The bridge was scorched. So what they decided to do was, well, let's just shore it up a little bit, okay? You know, and there's a picture of it right there. And so the engine, here comes the train from Townsville, and the train's coming backwards because there was no way to turn around up to Townsville. So drive forward up to Townsville and back all the way from Townsville all the way back to Manson. The cars got over onto the bridge, but when the engine got on there, the whole thing collapsed. And the whole thing, the two people that were working on the engineer and the fireman on the engine lost their lives there. It fell into Nutbush creek. It was bedded so far into the creek, they couldn't get it out. So when they built the lake, they flooded up this creek. If you've got a good depth finder, you can find it. It's right here north of Satellite Point and Louisville Park. Also, there was a plane in Kerr Lake in 1962, a small plane crashed with 2 people aboard, in the main part of the lake, the main channel of the lake. And remember I told you that the lake is about 90 to 100 feet deep in there? It was so deep, they didn't even bother to cut the trees down. When they made the lake, they went in, and they knew where the water was gonna rise, they cut all the trees down. They didn't even bother with the ones on the main channel. There's still an underwater forest.
Cypress tree.
Of dead trees. Yeah, if you ever notice when you go to Kerr Lake how much dripping is going on? That's a lot of the reason why. And a plane crashed there in 1962, and it literally took them weeks to recover the bodies and find the plane because it was.
Florence.
It was in this underwater forest. They finally had to get divers from the Navy to come, and they did eventually find it. Of course, I talked about the water system. There's the water plant. There's the pump house. That was probably a good PR move on their part. And I want to finish up just talking about some other dams locally, lakes locally. This is Falls Lake Dam, which was built as a water supply on the Neuse River for Wake County. It is about a third of the size of Kerr Lake, about 18,000 square feet, square miles, square acres, pardon me. But to show you how that construction work on that started in 1962 and didn't finish until 1984. Whoa. It cost $1.8 billion. It's only a third of the size of Kerr Lake, but costs almost twice as much. Why? Because of where it's located. The price of land was more then than it was in 1947. One of the really bad issues associated locally with Kerr Lake was the federal government came in, and if they wanted they wanted your land for the lake, they would offer you a price for it. If you did not take that price and you were not satisfied with it, just condemn it and take it. I have seen prices as low as $47 an acre for a man named Andrew Hargrove that lived about where Henderson Point is now. Even if you take that and extrapolate it in today's money, you're only talking about $400. So a lot of people lost a lot of good land with farm. Let me see if I and written it down. It is. Down how many, about 380 families were moved or lost property. About 2,100 graves had to be relocated, and about 56 cemeteries relocated. And some other local dams. This is the Everett Jordan Dam, Lake Jordan, which is built in the late 70s and early 80s. And this is Lake Gaston. Lake Gaston was built by Virginia Power and Electric. It's not built by the Corps. Anyway, that is basically a little bit about the history of Kerr Lake. This shows the watershed. It shows you how large the watershed of the river is, all the way up around Lynchburg, Roanoke, down to almost to Greensboro and Winston-Salem. That's the water system right now. There's another Kerr Lake. Kerr Lake. Robert S. Kerr Lake in Oklahoma. And it's interesting, that lake was built for navigational purposes to help tie Oklahoma City to be able to navigate to the Mississippi River and then out into the ocean. Kerr was very prominent and important senator from Oklahoma. You ever heard of Kerr-McGee Corporation? That's where the Kerr comes from. Interestingly enough, it's almost exactly the same size and configuration as our Kerr Lake. It looks a lot like Kerr Lake. And I compared the two maps there. One time I drove out to Denver about 20 years ago, and I stopped there just on my way, and I said, "I'm from Kerr Lake, North Carolina." And they said, "Really?" He said, "Well, we've got some mail for you." Anyway, it's interesting to me that there's another Kerr Lake out there. This is a view from the dam. And by the way, you can see bald eagles at Kerr Lake. I've seen them myself. And Kerr Lake is impressive. Like I said, the next time you ride by it and see it, it's a little more to it than just, sometimes we see things so often, we don't realize how significant they are. We don't realize some of the significant things that are over there. So that's a little bit about Kerr Lake. Do y'all have any questions or anything?
Do you know if they do tours?
They do tours, they do tours, they used to do tours of the power plant. I'm not sure since September 11th in 2001 that they do that.
I think it stopped.
And I think they probably, I would guess, they probably, as I mentioned, it's a very important strategic place, you know?
I like the Paul.
Do what?
That's a beautiful picture.
I know, I about flipped out. I was walking around the lake one day and I actually saw one fly by.
I've seen them, but
and-
never enough to get a picture.
Well, here's the thing about it, though. I was down at Nutbush, you know, and I was like, there were like gazillion people there. And I was like, everybody, there's a bald eagle. And I'm squirming around like, bald eagle like that. And everybody's looking at me like I'm crazy. And of course, by that point, when everybody turned around and looked, he had flown.
Oh,
One almost landed on my cousin
Really?
at Nutbush.
Yeah, you can see
We've seen
it's
several.
in Nutbush, yeah. And Nutbush is, I can remember when the hookups there were like $3 for a week. I don't know if y'all, but y'all have any more questions or comments about Blaine, anything like that?
no.
Well, if you'd like to learn more about the lake or local history, I invite you to come to North Carolina Richard H. Stone Library, which I understand some of you have some familiarity. Okay, thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you so much for your presentation.
And by the way, I just wanted to show you, if you want to take a look at this, this is the first map of Kerr Lake that was published in 1953.
Look like when you look at Carlet map, it look like Lake Gaston's into Carlet, like they connect.
Technically,
Don't they connect?
technically, Lake Gaston starts where Kerr Lake ends.
Thank you very much.
If you go to Kerr Lake and you're standing there looking up at the lake, everything in front of the dam is Lake Gaston. As a matter of fact, Bugs Island is not in Kerr Lake, it's in Lake Gaston.
And anything on the other side of the dam,
Anything on the other side of the dam, on
Lake
Black-
Gaston.
that's correct. Because it was built in 63 and backs all the way up to it. I mean, sometimes it has, technically it's still on there. And see, on beyond that, there's also a Roanoke River Lake, the other side of Lake Gaston.
It's not on the river, I don't know. Okay,
Well, thank you.
thank you so very much.